Yes, folks, welcome back to another episode of CamBro Conversations. And today's conversation, we are talking about the use of science within our approach to fitness. It's very often that we can go to extremes. We can go book smart and deal with absolutely the minutiae of every detail, or we can just go to very basic bro science and making terrible decisions with our approach to training. To discuss this topic, I'm joined by Harry Ranson, online coach and co-founder of A Taste of Fitness. Harry, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
Delighted to have you, Harry, and you've got a big act to follow in terms of your business partner. Lottie was a favourite guest for a lot of people in the podcast, so I'm sure you'll step up to the plate, Harry.
Yeah, so the best till last, mate.
This is it. In terms of a bit of a background then for the listeners, I mentioned you're an online coach and you founded A Taste of Fitness with your partner, Lottie. Give us a little bit of a background in your experience in the fitness industry.
So I've been in the fitness industry. I'm a bit of a dinosaur, really, for about, well, I suppose in kind of new world terms, about 12 years now. So I was about 18 when I started, and I did one-to-one first for about 7 years. Opened my own private personal training gym with a couple of pals of mine, and run that for 3 years. That's still going, but I decided to step away from that in 2016, and then that's when I started up A Taste of Fitness with Lottie, and been going ever since. So been full-time online for the last 4 years, but I've sort of been in the industry for a good 11 or 12 years now.
Yeah, Harry, and for those that don't know you and haven't seen your content on Instagram before, one of your famous content segments is whiteboard chats, and that for me is probably where you stand out from a lot of coaches in the industry, where you're creating content that is heavily evidence-based. However, it's distilled down into layman's terms. Has that been something that's always been an aim for you, or were you somebody that had to realize this over time?
Yeah, so I was coached myself actually in 2014 for a couple of natural bodybuilding competitions, and the guy that was coaching me, Eric Helms, his name was, some of your listeners might know who that is, and it was his communication style that really influenced my communication style, because before I was very confused about what to do. And you hear these things from the gym, just from your sort of general everyday gym goers, and it was just the way he communicated with me really influenced the way that I now communicate with my clients, because everything just clicked and made sense. And I thought, you know what, I just want to pass that on, because it was such an inspiration to me and such a revelation to kind of have that light bulb moment every time I spoke to him, that I was like, do you know what, I need to do this. And we also need to understand that people learn very differently. So a lot of the science and the evidence-based stuff is quite dense. So you obviously mentioned about the whiteboards. So I thought, do you know what, let's draw some pictures. Basically, let's get it on a whiteboard. Let's make it more visual, and let's just go through in a very sort of methodical way in order to try and explain some of these denser subjects. And obviously you do lose some of the detail there, but we just need to understand like what we need to do and what we need to know, and not necessarily some of those finer details.
The actionable applications from high level studies versus presenting the minutiae to Sarah and Darren at the gym, who are your clients that just want to look a bit better for their holiday next year, and you're pouring all this information onto them, but instead you're kind of pulling a little bit back from that, giving them the information that they need from the actual evidence and the kind of more heavy, like you said, heavy duty studies that would probably confuse a lot of people that may misinterpret them the wrong way. They may be just completely isolated by some of the terms that are used within these studies as well. And fitness, I think, is a relatively simple concept, particularly when it comes to body composition. However, we can dress it up in so many different ways that make it so much more complicated. And we're going to dive into a lot of different frequently asked questions tonight that some people have got answers for, which are completely unfounded, but then other people have gone the complete opposite direction and buried themselves in just far too much jargon and difficult language to make it a really hard subject to understand. Whereas one of the things that I love about your content, and I must have been following you now for about 4 years, since my brother and I started the page together, and yeah, I've always enjoyed the way that you distill things down and deliver it in a way that's actionable, rather than, like you say, trying to hide behind big fancy words.
Yeah, I mean, there's a term in science, I think it's parsimony, where it's basically, how can you take something and almost make it in its simplest form, essentially. So that's what you're trying to do, try and put something into its simplest form without removing some like really key steps, I guess. So that's a lot about what I try to do, and a lot of the reason why I like the science and the evidence based stuff is because actually I think it opens up more doors than it closes. When we look at fitness, it's, is it low carb or is it low fat, or is it this, is it that, is it this, is it that, and then you kind of realize that with science it's actually opened up quite a bit more. Like, it doesn't have to be necessarily an either or thing. It's a case of looking at, okay, these are the two options we have. What's your current sort of training status? What's your current goal? And how can we fit you into that, rather than it just being very much, you have to intermittent fast, or you have to do HIIT training or something like that. It's like, okay, well, do you get hungry in the morning? No, then, intermittent fasting might be a good thing for you. And I think people think science is very confusing, and we're always looking for what's optimal. But from my perspective, the way that I've seen it is actually, it's opened up so many more doors and avenues, and it's taken a lot of the stuff that you hear in the gym and actually dispelled it, to be honest.
Yeah, a lot of the myths that come about through, and I think the term we'll use is bro science, where you kind of, it's the biggest guy in the gym or the most ripped guy in the gym that maybe naturally is just in fantastic shape, but does things that are completely contrarian to science and logic, but is passing on advice. So, for example, you've got to drink your protein shake within 5 minutes after your workout with a high glycemic carb like a banana or a Rice Krispie square bar. Otherwise, the gym session was a waste of time. That grows arms and legs over the years. And I know back in the day when I started training, I would quite often rush to the changing room, to my locker, get my shake out. I had a friend that I trained with who would rush to the changing room and open a tin of tuna, which was
Nice.
rank in terms of the smell, Harry. But he believed that was the way to get gains. Don't get me wrong, he got in good shape, but it wasn't necessarily because of that. However, maybe younger people or people in our peer group seeing that were thinking that's the solution. So I guess that's where some of the bro science myths come from, and some of the limitations of that are that they're actually not applicable when it comes down to it. Many of the people listening will be people who work in careers that want to fulfill their best fitness potential outside of their business career. But we have a lot of coaches and personal trainers listening to podcasts as well, Harry. What kind of sources do you use to build up this knowledge over the years and distill it down for clients?
A lot of it depends on kind of how much time you have. So there are a good few resources. So there's MASS, which is the monthly application of strength sport. And that goes through, about 10 studies a month or something like that related to, strength and hypertrophy and all of those sorts of things. So that's a really good resource. Examine.com is a great resource for supplementation. So whenever anyone asks me about supplement, I typically send them there. We can go through a few bits later if you want about how you can actually sort of level that up a little bit. I've got a few sort of tips and tricks to help people out with choosing supplements and things like that. Weightology, a guy called James Krieger runs Weightology as well. Chris Beardsley runs a strength and conditioning one. So there's various sort of research reviews out there. But also PubMed is a good one. So PubMed or Google Scholar it's almost like a Google, but for science, essentially. Not all of the science is available for free, but some of them you get kind of free publications. And you can just kind of, go and have a look around. I mean, you do end up in a little bit of a rabbit hole. It's sort of the equivalent of YouTube related, when you're watching like cat videos at 1 a.m. It's sort of like that, where you've got about 3 million tabs open on and you just don't know where you're looking at, just random things on PubMed. But I often find myself down a bit of a PubMed rabbit hole, to be honest.
Yeah, that's some good sources that are available for people. Like you say, there's some of those that are free, some of those that are pay to play, but equally depending on what you're looking to get from that. So if you are somebody like me that's quite inquisitive but doesn't necessarily need to know the science, I might read the odd one here and there, maybe to help me create an Instagram post. But for somebody that's a coach like yourself that really wants to get into the minutia of it and then find out maybe something that can take your clients forward or deal with a particular challenge that a group of your clients are having, then there's a wee bit more skin in the game to invest that time within it.
I mean, I think it's important for even though my clients and followers and stuff aren't necessarily interested in reading, I think it's important for them to know that I am reading it rather than just spouting nonsense essentially. So I've kind of got to do my due diligence to make sure that I'm putting out the best information that I can. And things change, science isn't perfect. And sometimes my interpretation of the science might not always be correct, but typically I take the stance of do no harm. So I'm not going to suggest that people do things that are going to harm them, obviously, but you've kind of got to make up your own interpretations as well with the science.
Spot on, Harry. And what are some of the limitations, before we dive into some frequently asked questions? We've spoken a lot there about benefits. What are some of the limitations when it comes to these studies and some of the pitfalls that you maybe see people in your industry fall into?
Yeah, so there are a few sort of very surface level limitations which most people will be able to kind of pick out straight away. There's obviously like sort of statistical analysis and stuff, which, to be fair, even I don't understand those, where there can be some issues there. But surface level ones would be, is it in the population that you are actually interested in? Because that's quite a common one where CLA was quite popular. I think it still is, to be honest, with some people. But to be honest, it hasn't really been shown to be effective apart from being in obese females. So that's almost two populations there. So it's being obese and being a female. If you are a lean, resistance trained male, there's no research to suggest that it's effective. Something like that is a bit of a limitation, and that's just something that people can pick out straight away. I see a lot of people, and it really, really bugs me. It's one of those things that bugs me, and probably no one else realizes it, is when people share like rodent studies on mice and rats and things like that, because 9 times out of 10 it's not going to transfer. It's still interesting, don't get me wrong, and we still need to do that testing in order to create a hypothesis and kind of move it onto human trials. But like, it's just, don't talk about it like it's fact when you've just got like this mouse or whatever, this rat study. It's just not applicable. So I think something like that is just really easy for people to spot, even in just looking at the abstract, like just the description of the study itself. You can just be like, okay, well, is this relevant? And it's not a fault of science necessarily, because it's difficult to recruit people for science. So a lot of the time it will be sort of college aged, or university aged students that have never been to the gym before, but they've got the time, they maybe they've got to do it to get some sort of credit or something like that.
Yeah.
So you've got to understand that there are always going to be limitations to science. But again with science, we let that dictate sort of the bigger picture stuff, but we still need to consider the individual. Do you know what I mean? Like, you wouldn't look at a scientific study and be like, right, everyone should do this.
Yep.
Most people should probably do this, but there's always going to be outliers and things like that.
It needs to be, I think one of the key things you said there is applicable, and that's the same as any information that we distill down. It needs to be applicable to the population that we're directing at. And like you say, mouse and rat studies or studies with a population group that's completely unrelated to your target demographic or to you as an individual. If you're somebody listening to this looking to implement a more scientific approach, you need to make sure that what you've just read is applicable to you and actually would have an impact on you that the study says it will, because the study may be commenting on a completely separate demographic. So we've talked a little bit about interpreting studies, and one of your key roles, Harry, is interpreting studies so people don't have to. One of the key questions that you've been asked in recent times, and I'm sure any content creator will recognize this in their DMs, but how do you know if a supplement's worth taking?
So like I said, I think examine.com is a really, really good resource. And I think they're quite unique in the sense that they don't make their money from supplement sales. And I think that that's super important, because again, that's a limitation of science and research as well, is sometimes like, where is that funding source? Who are they backed by? Why are they saying it? And that's not to say, that people that share supplements and sell supplements, they're all crooks or anything like that. But it's important that we understand that the information is unbiased. So examine.com is a really great resource. But one thing that I tell a lot of people to do is make sure that, if it's a multi-ingredient supplement, as most supplements are these days, like pre-workouts and sleep supplements and stuff like that. Yeah. A client of mine the other day sent me, it was a stress and anxiety supplement. So you can read all the spiel that says, oh, it makes you, this, that, and the other. But it's like, right, let's look at the label now and let's kind of cross-reference that with examine.com. So rather than just kind of looking at all the spiel and stuff, look at the ingredients and think, okay, well, is this ingredient effective? So it can be quite laborious, but it improves your knowledge, but it also means it's going to save you money potentially. Yeah. And know whether that is worth taking. So again, my client sent me this supplement. So I went onto the website, I checked all the ingredients against examine.com, and it actually checked out. So you're looking at is that ingredient effective in what you want it to be effective in? And B, is it in the effective dose? Because there's a lot of supplements that, it will have, pre-workouts are synonymous for this really. It will have beta alanine, it will have citrulline malate, it will have caffeine, which is great because they're all effective, depending on what you're doing. But they're like drastically underdosed. Yep. So you actually, what I recommend to people then is actually, double scoop it, or even 3 scoops and turn into that baby meme or whatever it is. But you could be just spending loads of money on a subpar supplement that you've got a double dose. So you might normally get 30 servings, but you're only actually getting 15. So you're spending all this money, and also probably a minor one. People won't necessarily come up with this, but also looking at the type of supplement. So magnesium is a classic one. There's like 6 or 7 different magnesiums, and magnesium oxide, I think it's oxide and sulfate, aren't absorbed as well as some of the others like citrate and things like that. So it's important that, again, are the supplement manufacturers putting in poorer quality supplement, and it can be, like I said, it can be a bit of a minefield. But that would be my first port of call, is to sort of check the supplements against examine. Are they effective doses? Are they even effective in what you want them to be effective in? And then that's going to give you a little bit more of an idea of whether to buy that supplement or not.
That's a really helpful guide, Harry. And I think to come in on the dosage point, that's a huge one. So I, thankfully, well pre-COVID, not to use the C word too much in this podcast, but in terms of dosage for vitamin D3, the vast majority of supplements are way below what we actually need. I think it's between 5,000 to 10,000 IU that we actually need as an effective dose, particularly in the UK, and particularly for any of our fellow listeners north of the border where we have very limited sun, Harry. Whereas the vast majority of like your boots, even your MyProtein, your bulk powders, there's like 1,000 IU. So you would need to take 5 of those per day to hit your minimum. And ideally for a weight trained male of 75, 80, 85 kilos, you need 10,000 IU. So I've had to shop around for ones that are actually of the right dosage, because previously I was maybe taking it, but I was getting a minimum dose that probably wasn't even the minimum effective dose. So that's a leading example for me, and I think a big point, because like you say, think of the pre-workouts, maybe they've got 300 mega caffeine, which is plenty, but it'll be underdosed in the citrulline malate and the beta alanine. So effectively you're just buying a very, very expensive white monster that you've drank 2 of. Like
yeah. I mean, it's the same for actually, like you said, it's the same for fish oil as well. Yeah. So you'll often spend more to get one that has a higher EPA and DHA, but like your typical, from like you said, your Boots or your supermarket, wherever, it'll have about 300 milligrams of combined. But you can get them from and then MyProtein, bulk, whatever. I won't say it just in case you're affiliated. But you just various different companies where you'll get sort of 750 milligrams. So you only need to take 2 or 3 of them. Whereas the other ones, you need to take like 7 of them to get an effective dose. And although it seems more expensive, it actually works out cheaper in the long run.
Yeah, cheaper, but also you're paying for what you get. It's the same as when somebody's like, oh, I've got an online coach, but they cost me £30 a month, but their service is absolutely atrocious, whereas the online coach costs £120 a month. You're like, oh, I spend a lot more a month, but your return is actually tangible. Whereas before you're not covering your bases. And it's funny you touch on affiliation. So yeah, I do work with my protein, but I don't get the vast majority of I don't get my omegas, I don't get my vitamin D from them because they're underdosed. I actually had to go to NU Nutrition, who I found through Amazon, and I do work with them now, but equally I had to go and look for the right partner and the right brand to actually get an effective dose, because like you say, the omega-3 and 6 and then the vitamin D3 was way underdosed for your kind of over-the-counter or your standard supplement shop. So you actually have to go and seek out an effective dose, or effectively you are just paying for quite an expensive little capsule that you have every morning, although it's cheaper than the one that actually works.
Yeah, but it is more expensive in the sense that you're literally getting no benefit from it, i.e. So
yeah, exactly that. So that's us covered a fairly common question in terms of how to figure out if supplements worth taking. The listeners can start with examine.com. They can look at the doses. They can look at whether there's any evidence if that's actually a useful supplement for the effect that they're looking to get. Because like you say, if they're looking at a pre-workout to improve performance and there's a lot of ingredients on the back of this label that isn't related to something tangible from performance, they're effectively just paying for a cocktail that's quite expensive and doesn't really justify the use.
Just paying for fillers, really.
I think there's a lot of fillers in these supplements as well. I found that with greens powders as well. I don't know if you've got an opinion on those, but sometimes you look at the stuff that's in the back of greens powders and you're wondering whether you're actually getting any fruit or veg, or whether it's just polyphenol.
Well, I
and
think
sugars.
it's actually kind of like what you said earlier, where you've got some people that talk about science and they're just using all these big words and they're sort of hiding behind it. I think it's almost that thought process that the more is better, and if it's got blueberry extract and blackberry extract and raspberry extract, like just throw all the berries in there, like, and just hope for the best, So I think it's a similar sort of thing, really. It's like people think more is better, but it's like actually what is effective.
Yeah, exactly that. To move on from supplements then, one of the key things that I've seen you speak about in recent years, Harry, is around hunger. And anyone that has ever dieted before, or anyone that is remotely fitness focused and is eating clean and all that kind of good stuff, they will have experienced an element of hunger. However, there are so many different ways that we can actually reduce hunger that are science-based rather than placebo or false. What are some of those ways that you would talk about, Harry?
So the first thing I mention whenever someone is concerned about hunger, you probably think I'm going to say food volume or something like that, but it's quite difficult to avoid hunger completely. And it's more about managing when you get hungry so that it doesn't catch you by surprise, because that's when most people slip up. Is that, normally it's 3:00 in the afternoon, they haven't got anything on them, they're super hungry, they go into the petrol station or the supermarket and they just end up just buying whatever. So if you can employ a little bit of structure so that you can manage that hunger. So it might be a case of, you get hungry maybe an hour before each meal time. That's fine. But at least it's coming. Okay. So, maybe you have your lunch at 1 p.m., 12 p.m., stomach starts rumbling a little bit, but it's like, do you know what? It's kind of like, I don't know if you've ever done any sort of outdoor running, but you kind of like, it's like you run to the next lamppost and the next road and stuff like that.
Yep.
It's kind of like that. You can see that light at the end of the tunnel. Whereas if you just get randomly hungry and you've got nothing on you, that's when, shit hits the fan, basically. So that would be my first thing and that's where, something like it's intermittent fasting might work for some people. It doesn't work for everyone, but it's something that I occasionally do. Again, I don't do it necessarily, I do it usually during a fat loss phase. And it's more a case of not for the benefits of, whatever people say these days, autophagy and all that sort of jazz. It's more a case of like, well, if I do that, at least I know I'm going to be hungry then, and then I'm going to be fine then. So it's not about avoiding hunger completely. It's more about managing and knowing when it's going to come so that you can go about the rest of your day and you're not going to worry about it. It's not going to trip you up.
Yeah, just to come in on that hunger point, Harry, in terms of like knowing that you're hungry maybe an hour before a meal and structure, I'm a big advocate of eating at similar times if you can, because our bodies are habit driven, and the listeners are probably rolling their eyes because I always talk about James Clear's Atomic Habits and structure and routine. But I absolutely know that I normally have lunch about 12:15 when I'm working at home or when I'm working in the office outside of the current period. And I 100% know at 11:45, 12 o'clock, my stomach will start to go. Whereas if I've been on a weekend, if I'm out of routine and I've smashed like a big meal at like 11 o'clock, my stomach is still thinking 12 o'clock, Colin, you're going to eat now. And I'm like, no, you're full. So hunger and structure is actually really linked. And I'm glad that you raised that as one of the first points from a kind of evidence-based perspective. Like, we are inevitably going to be hungry at some points. And just to address that hunger isn't necessarily always a bad thing. I'm eating a lot of food at the moment. I'm in a fairly, maybe a maintenance kind of gaining phase. And I'm eating a lot of food, maybe north of 3,500, 4,000 calories. And I still get hungry at points during the day because hunger's relative, and it just, your appetite adjusts and your body adjusts to when it expects to be fed. And I know that you've pushed your food up over the years, Harry, and you've dieted on higher foods than a lot of people would have done, similar to myself. And you know that you will still experience hunger at that, whereas somebody else eating that amount of food would be completely satiated and saturated. And it's all relative in that respect. So first things first, we've talked about structure. We've talked about the different awareness of when we're hungry. So it might be, like you say, intermittent fasting is a great tool for somebody who wakes up, goes to work, and doesn't even notice that they're hungry until 11 o'clock. And then if they wait till 12, they're going to be fine. Or somebody, in contrast to that, might be wake up in the morning absolutely ravenous and have to smash some food in. What are some of the other ways that are kind of beyond structure that they can manage their hunger?
So yeah, the next one would probably be looking at managing your food volume. There's a really interesting resource. I always pick it out. Weirdly, when you go on the website, it says it's like not ready to be launched or something like that. It's called caloriegallery.com.
Okay.
But it's been in that phase for like probably 8 years now. It's literally ancient. But it's really interesting. It's a visual representation of what 200 calories looks like, of like various different foods. So it's just really interesting, and I think it's a bit of an eye opener for most people. And again, going back to sort of the whiteboard chats, I think like visually it kind of helps people understand. It's like, wow, that's what 200 calories of lettuce is, and that's what 200 calories of like peanut butter is, and it's literally like just a massive difference. So ultimately, you know, you could fill your calories with 400 grams of food or 4 kilograms, 4,000 grams of food, yep, depending on how you go about it. Now, I do think you can sort of go too far with it. Obviously, you can end up, people talk about being like super bloated and things like that. So you obviously got to be careful of that. But, 9 times out of 10, when I have someone come to me who says, I'm really hungry, and I have a look at their food volume, and it's not necessarily that their food choices are bad at all, but they could just maybe shift things around a bit. So for example, let's say someone's plate is half of it is rice and half of it is vegetables. You might turn 3/4 of it into vegetables and 1/4 of it into rice or something like that. It's not that rice is a bad thing, it's just it might not fill you up necessarily as much or give you as much food volume
Bang for your buck.
Yeah, and it is typically going to be the kind of the starchier carbohydrates. Fats are going to be one of those, and obviously those things are still important. They can still definitely be incorporated, but when you've got someone having half a bar of dairy milk, and the big one we're talking about at the end of the day, and they're talking about being hungry, and it's just sort of like, well, can we be a little bit smarter with how we're kind of distributing our food volume, basically?
Yeah, and prioritizing that food volume when you're hungry throughout the day. So I know a lot of people who work in offices and work office roles will prioritize something voluminous for their lunch, because that's when they typically are sat down at a desk and just shoveling away. So you need to feel like you've eaten something. So salads at that point and lots of vegetables at that point to bulk out the meal can play a really good role. Whereas if you smash in a sandwich or a baguette, you're not getting the same amount of chews and kind of digestive cues as you would get from eating a little bit more and something with a little bit more bite and chew to it. And I'm not going to get into that bracket of people counting their chews and stuff like that, Harry. I think we would be down a rabbit hole at that stage. But I certainly think that people eating more high volume, lower calorie foods to bulk out their meals at times when they feel more hungry will certainly help with regards to that. And you touched on a little bit there about quality of nutrition within that. What role does that play when it comes to satiation of your hunger?
So There's a lot of research that looks at kind of it's more a case of like when you have ultra processed foods. There was a recent paper looking at ultra processed foods and its sort of role in obesity, and it's quite obvious when you think about it, but it just showed when people are eating ad libitum, which is basically have as much as they want, they tend to eat more calories when they're eating sort of ultra processed food. So when you eat something that and typically they go hand in hand. When you have something that's a little bit less processed, like it tends to be fruit and vegetables and things like that. And I think it just gets to a point where like you can only eat so much you're not going to eat 2,000 calories of salad, are you? Because you're going to be full and satisfied before you get to 2,000 calories. Whereas, if you had, a burger and chips or something, that can easily be done. And you might not even be super satisfied after that. You probably feel a bit minging, to be honest. But, I think that if you're having kind of more nutritious foods, they just tend to be lower in calories and higher in volume, really. Obviously, the more kind of nutrients, vitamins, minerals, you also got fiber as well, which can slow down gastric emptying, which can make you feel a bit fuller. Just in terms of general energy and things like that as well. So you might find that, people, they think they're hungry, but it's just because they've got low energy, because they're eating poor quality of foods, because they're nutrient deficient. So it kind of all plays hand in hand. Obviously, there's a balance to be had there. We can't just eat 100% whole foods all the time, but it should really make up the core of your nutrition, really.
Yeah, great points, Harry. And I think when it comes to that quality of nutrition, like you say, the choices tend to lend themselves to being more voluminous for the calories and therefore more filling in terms of the amount of eating you're doing. They tend to be higher fiber. And like you say, that slows down the digestion process and fills up the gut a little bit more. What about for those that talk about protein as the most satiating macronutrient? Is there any evidence behind that?
So there's actually quite a lot coming out at the moment. A lot of people sort of saying that it's not. So typically, protein in and of itself isn't necessarily more satiating, but diets higher in protein are more satiating. So that you can't just eat sort of unlimited chicken breast. But when we're comparing diets, if you had a diet that was 50 grams of protein, 100 grams of carbs and 50 grams of fat, that would be horrendous. But then if we compare, like, switch that around and we had 100 grams of protein and 50 grams of carbs and 50 grams of fat, the higher protein would be better. So I think in general, it's probably not a bad thing to increase that protein a little bit and have your diet maybe, I don't tend to prescribe macros and stuff in percentages and stuff, but if you probably do want to kind of push that percentage of protein up a little bit higher if you want to feel a little bit more satisfied.
Yeah, that makes total sense, Harry. And I know when I've done dieting phases where I'm digging a little bit more, I prioritize protein remaining high for body composition reasons and muscle retention, but also for satiation. Because I know if I have 200 grams of chicken breast with 150 grams of rice, I feel more full than if I have 150 grams of chicken breast with 200 grams of rice. And whether that's right or wrong, I certainly feel that the chicken takes longer to eat for starters, but it also satiates you more, and it kind of when it hits your stomach, you feel that a little bit fuller. And I suppose it's, even if it is placebo, I certainly have noticed it over the years. And I suppose, like you say, where there's a higher protein content within your diet, you do tend to feel fuller overall within your meals.
Mm-hmm. There's another one as well, like a bit of a bonus one is, which has been talked about a little bit more recently, and it's actually the viscosity of your foods. So, for example, if you were to have, like yogurt's a classic example, like a Greek yogurt that tends to be a little bit thicker is going to potentially keep you fuller than like a natural yogurt, which is going to be thinner. Okay. So that's another interesting one as well, is kind of the viscosity of your foods. And it might even be worth, if you're making a protein shake, to actually use it with less liquid, in order to, it helps with that sort of like mouth feel as well. So it doesn't feel like you're just drinking a normal drink. You're actually trying to make foods a little bit thicker, in order to kind of get a little bit, it's kind of like, with like casein protein tends to be a little bit thicker. And it kind of, apparently that tends to help with kind of hunger a little bit as well. So
there we go. Well, that's it. That's new information for me there, Harry. So it's a Harry Ranson exclusive on the podcast when it comes to thickness of your food, how thick your food is. Thick with 2 C's at the end. So You
Reese's.
you mentioned the word liquid there. Liquid calories is the bane of so many people's fat loss attempts, and I always laugh when people in the office are wondering how I can eat 3 bagels and a couple of bananas and stay in my shape they are, when they will happily have 2 or 3 teas a day with 4 or 5 sugars in it. And I'm thinking, well, probably swap that for this. You could even swap it for a donut if you wanted, and you'd have
Yeah.
more fullness. What does the evidence say about liquid calories? I certainly know from something I've seen before that pretty much it hits a certain level of calories. Is that right? And from there on, it doesn't provide any more satiety, regardless of how many calories that liquid has.
So yeah, I mean, in terms of liquid calories, I'm not sure if I've read that paper. Maybe I have, maybe I haven't. But yeah, just in terms of liquid calories, it comes down to that kind of viscosity thing that I just mentioned as well. You're just not going to get the same sort of satisfaction as food, because you don't have, as you mentioned earlier, you don't have that chewing. You don't have that kind of that mouthfeel and that sensation. And it's funny because you speak to people who want to lose fat, and they're drinking loads of liquid calories, and they're wondering why they're not losing weight. And then you speak to someone who wants to put on weight, and they're eating all of their calories and they're not drinking any of liquid calories. And you're like, right, if we could just kind of swap roles here,
Yeah.
you would both be better off. Because you get a lot of hard gainers that are just like, oh, I can't eat all this food. It's like, well, drink your calories then. Do the opposite to what these other people are doing, because it is just so easy to drink calories. You just got to look at the calories in alcohol.
Yeah,
How
exactly.
easy. Not I'm suggesting that for hard gainers, obviously, but it's just very easy to drink, and you're just not going to get the same satisfaction in any way compared to food. So
Of course. And one of the other areas that I know plays a leading role around hunger, and I'll be interested to hear what some of the research says, and we have had a professor from Stanford talk a little bit around this within a kind of wider conversation, but what role does sleep play when it comes to hunger and management of it?
yeah, so there is an interesting paper that looks at it was basically, I can't remember what's the title of it. It's something about how sleep affects your ability to lose fat, basically. And a lot of it has to do with leptin and ghrelin. So we got these two hormones that kind of help trigger sort of hunger and satiety and fullness and stuff like that. So we tend to see those sort of hormones get a little bit out of whack. So your leptin drops and your ghrelin increases. So you basically just get really hungry. And another thing that a lot of people don't consider as well is that if you're not getting enough sleep, you are awake for longer, which means you've got to spread your food out even more.
Yeah.
So, in an ideal world, we'd go like full sloth mode, sleep for, I don't know, 20 hours a day, and then just eat for 4 hours, and that'd be great, fantastic. But if we're getting sort of 5 or 6 hours a night, then that means that we've then got to spread our food out over 18, 19 hours,
Yeah.
rather than if we were getting 8 or 9 hours a night. We kind of condense that eating window. And as we know from various sort of fasting research, we know that like reducing that eating window can really help with things like hunger. And yeah, I mean, obviously getting less sleep as well means that we typically see, so there was a study that looked at 8.5 hours of sleep versus 5.5 hours of sleep.
Yep.
The group that got 8.5 hours, they lost more fat and less muscle. 5.5 hours, I think they might have even lost more muscle than they did fat. Obviously, there's issues with body composition testing, so it could have just been like a bit of an error there. But it was quite clear, the comparison between the two, that you lose more muscle and you lose less fat.
Yeah. And equally, your training was probably worse because you were more fatigued. You had decision fatigue. Like you say, your hormones were all over the place, but also you've got that longer eating window. So yeah, certainly we bang the drum for sleep on this podcast. So that just adds to that as well. Last thing to discuss with regards to hunger, Harry, what about people that maybe take breaks from dieting and building those? Lottie spoke about it on her episode, where many of your clients will have a maintenance phase after a fat loss phase to try and reset where their head's at from a kind of diet fatigue mentality. But what about from an actual hunger perspective?
Well, I think it's just a case of like cumulatively over time, you just get more and more hungry. And, you know, we see those hormones, they don't just necessarily drop overnight. They're going to sort of drop slowly and increase slowly depending on what hormones we're looking at here. So I think it just gets to a point where you just become insatiable. You cannot overcome it. You know, you can introduce like higher days of food, like refeed days or something like that, and that can kind of keep you ticking over. But it sort of gets to a point where that just sort of doesn't touch the sides. And ultimately, a lot of the time it comes to just being able to extend the diet for longer. I think that, you know, people get to a point where they get so hungry, they get lots of cravings, and you don't want to force a square peg into a round hole. You want to make sure that they are, and also, you know, not that we've got the time to get into it now, but you don't want to set up any sort of disordered eating patterns as well.
Yep.
Because if you start forcing people and suggesting that people continue when their body's kind of telling them not to, then you're potentially going to set up something that is going to harm people for the long term. So having a diet break is kind of a 2 steps forward, 1 step back scenario, whereby, yeah, it might feel like you're going backwards a little bit because you're just maintaining, but it means that you can continue on rather than just playing this sort of like snakes and ladders game where you just, you know, you diet down and then you end up, you know, overeating and you gain it all back again. So a diet break is just a good opportunity to kind of, very similar to a deload in training. You just let your body just recover a little bit. You let some of those hormones recover a little bit. You reduce some of that hunger. You get rid of some of those cravings because you can increase the food intake for, you know, a week or 2 weeks, maybe even longer than that. And it just means people can last a little bit longer. I always compare it to like a pit stop in Formula One.
Okay.
You know, obviously they need a pit stop to refuel in Formula One, and I bet that pisses off the drivers no end because they can see people racing past them. But ultimately, if they didn't take that, if you didn't change the tires, if they didn't get that fuel, they wouldn't be able to complete the course.
Yep.
So they need to, sometimes you need to incorporate a diet break or a refeed or something, just so people can actually get to where they want to be. Because in a lot of cases, people have a lot more fat to lose than they think they do.
Yep.
And sometimes if you're losing beyond, say, 8 to 10% of your body weight in one hit, that's going to just be incredibly challenging. So it might be a case of be like, right, let's lose 8 to 10% body weight. Let's take a couple of weeks off. Let's try and tie that in. Maybe if you're going away on holiday or something like that, let's try and tie it in with that. And then we can do another 8 weeks, 8 or 10 weeks, 12 weeks, whatever it may be. But when you actually look at the bigger picture, that person's then dieted down for 16 weeks rather than grinding it out for 10 or 12 and feeling miserable at the end of it.
Yeah,
so
significant point there, Harry. And I think, like you say, there's a lot to that with regards to the mental aspect, but also, like you say, it's that period where their hormones with regards to their hunger levels and driving them to potentially overeat or give into more temptation when it comes to having access to hyperpalatable foods again, probably on holiday, which we often see, don't we? People blow up afterwards or after a show or a shoot, people get access to this food again and they have no way to regulate fullness because they've been dieting. So like you say, that break in the middle of 2, 3, 4 weeks, however long you want to go for, can allow us to reset that, but also from a mental standpoint as well as hormonal. So no, lots within that when it comes to hunger there, and a very frequently asked question. Next up, Harry, how do we actually reduce DOMS? And for those that don't know, DOMS are delayed onset of muscle soreness.
So we still don't really know what DOMS are. You know, a lot of people have sort of speculation about, you know, is it muscle damage? Is it metabolite buildup? But we're still quite unsure. So in terms of ways to reduce it, the main ways that we get DOMS is typically when we're doing novel exercises. So I played randomly. I played in a football match. It was years ago now. I used to play football quite a bit when I was younger, up until I was about 18. And then I played in it. It was like a dad's 60th football match or something like that. And I hadn't played for a while. And honestly, the DOMS afterwards were absolutely ridiculous. But it's just because I hadn't played football for years. So DOMS isn't always indicative of muscle gain because I'm not going to be gaining muscle running around a football pitch. But it's because it was a new stimulus to me. And, you know, playing 90 minutes, well, I say playing, I was probably on standing around for most of it. But on the pitch for 90 minutes, that's a lot in one hit. So my recommendation, if you're doing something new, so maybe you're starting a new program, maybe you're doing an exercise that you haven't done for quite a while, and this goes for endurance or strength as well. If you're going running and you've signed up to a marathon, you don't want to be going out and doing 10K on your first run. Yeah. You want to kind of slowly build up that tolerance. There's something called the repeated bout effect, where basically your body sets up this protective mechanism in order for you to not get DOMS quite as badly. So anyone that's been through DOMS knows that it tends to get better the more you do something. So your body will adjust to it, but typically my best advice, and something I do with quite a lot of my clients, normally they might do say 3-4 sets of an exercise, but when we're sort of introducing them to the program, we might just do 1 or 2 sets, because it's slowly building up that volume, slowly building up that tolerance. The chances are they're still going to have DOMS, but it's not going to be, I don't want to go to the gym again DOMS. Yep. Now, I tend to coach kind of intermediate, I would say. I wouldn't say I coach super advanced people that are generally intermediates, but when I was doing one-to-one, I coached a lot of beginners, and it was super important back then that you didn't push them too hard, because you wanted them to come back. I think sometimes it's a bit of a badge of honor for people to be like, oh, couldn't walk the next day. Yep. But actually, you've got to think, are you going to be able to perform the next day? If you can't, sit down, the next time you come to do a leg press, you're not going to be able to perform that movement correctly.
Agreed.
And you're not going to be able to push the performance and things like that.
So from an applicable perspective, increased exposure gradually over time will enable us to not get crippling DOMS. Don't get me wrong. I think a lot of us like maybe that little bit of soreness to know that we've progressed a weight, and we should get that when we've pushed beyond, but it shouldn't be crippling, like you said, Harry, where it affects performance a day, 2, 3 days later.
Yeah, I think that, like you said, like DOMS can be good to kind of feel it in certain muscle groups. I think especially if you're trying to grow a particular muscle group, for example, and if you're doing a bench press and you feel it in your traps, it's probably a bit of an issue, isn't there? Yeah. So it can at least kind of give us an idea. Another thing with DOMS, or that affects DOMS, is it tends to be eccentric actions that can cause a lot of DOMS. So if you're doing excessive eccentric actions, like very slow eccentric loading, so the lowering of the weight, you might want to kind of speed that up a bit. If you're doing sort of 6-second eccentrics and you have crippling DOMS, you might want to try 2 or 3-second eccentrics. Just making sure that you are obviously in control of the load, but not extending it so much that you're just causing this DOMS, basically.
Yeah. What are some of the tried and tested measures that, alongside increased exposure, that people might want to implement when it comes to decreasing their DOMS from an actual scientific perspective?
So there's not a huge amount. There's been quite a lot of studies on it, but not a huge amount in terms of like being effective, really. Foam rolling tends to reduce muscle soreness a little bit. So the research suggests that you're looking at 2 minutes per sort of muscle area, directly after the workout, and then every 24 hours for the next sort of 3 or 4 days. Yep. So, if you train at 5, then you would do it at 5 o'clock the next day, 5 o'clock. I mean, it probably doesn't really matter too much as long as you're sort of doing it every day for 2 minutes on the affected area. Now, the likelihood is that, I don't know about you, but you don't get DOMS everywhere. You just tend to get it in quite specific muscles. Yeah. So it doesn't mean that you've got to spend, 3 hours foam rolling. It might just be a case of, foam rolling. That's been shown to help DOMS a little bit. Again, none of these are going to be like night and day differences. I think the exposure and the eccentric actions are probably going to be the best thing. Also, there's a little bit of evidence. So there's a meta-analysis that came out, I think it was maybe 2 years ago, that looked at compression garments. Yep. So that's an interesting one as well. So obviously just helping with that kind of vasodilation and vasoconstriction, sort of helping with blood flow. So that's something as well that you might look at doing. I mean, yeah, those are the kind of the two. I mean, there's been other things like sort of water immersion and stuff like that, but the evidence is quite mixed, and massage, it's quite mixed, really.
And also, some of these need to be like actionable and feasible for your average person. So we all talk about cold water therapy and like jumping in the ocean every day or something like that, and that's all well and good. But if you're somebody that works in a corporate career and you're being asked to go and find an ocean at 6 o'clock every morning before you go into the office, it's maybe a little bit outside of your your access.
Yeah.
Whereas a foam roller and gradually building up your program and being careful about how slow you lower a load sometimes is something that's an awful lot more actionable, both from a scientific perspective, but also from a lifestyle perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Now, on to one of the headlines that will get you a lot of clicks on Instagram, Harry, and probably me as well over the years: how to stay lean year round. Because you and I do it well. I don't know. Is there science behind it, or are we just lucky, as some people will say?
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned earlier about me being able to diet on the high calories. I actually don't.
Oh, really?
I think
Have I got
you
this
diet on
wrong?
much higher calories than I do. Yeah. So, no, I mean, one thing, obviously, there's various things that look at being able to sort of maintain weight loss, and it's actually incredibly difficult for a lot of people to do. But I was actually reading a study today, and it looked at personality traits of people that are able to stay a little bit leaner, or kind of maintain their weight loss and their fat loss. And it was an increased level of conscientiousness. Say that 5 times fast. And it was basically things like conscientiousness is things like, the self-discipline and having order and having structure and things like that. And you obviously spoke about structure earlier, because a lot of what people do is that they'll go on this diet, they'll follow, they'll have this structure, they'll eat the same meals every day, or not the same meals necessarily, but like they'll eat the same times, they'll do their food shopping at the beginning of the week, like everything will be prepared. And then as soon as that diet's over, that just all goes to pot. And they just sort of, portions start to increase slowly, and structure starts to kind of break down a little bit. So that's one thing. But something that you probably want me to say is building more muscle is probably, I think, one thing that really helps with staying leaner. And the problem with that is that it does take time. I mean, how long have you been training now?
11 years, 12 years. It's a long
Yeah,
time.
exactly. So like, you probably find it easier to stay lean now than you perhaps did maybe 5 or 6 years ago,
So much easier.
because you've got a little bit more muscle. So it's not something that's going to happen overnight, but if you strive to build more muscle and you're not on a perpetual diet, because I think that's the problem sometimes, is that people diet for 3 months, they do nothing for 3 months, they don't even train, and then they diet again. If you can be a little bit more disciplined with still putting in that effort even when you're not dieting, I think that over the course of time, it makes it easier it's not that you are leaner, it's that you appear leaner. When we're talking about being leaner, we're talking about having, like, I guess I'm talking about having a low body fat percentage. But when you build more muscle, your body fat percentage doesn't need to be as low to look good. You think about people that have massive muscles like bodybuilders, they look lean all the time.
Yep.
Because they just have massive muscles. And that might not always be achievable to everyone, but like the bigger the muscles you have, the leaner you can look at slightly higher body fat percentages. And that might be a little bit of a compromise for most people, because if you and I see it all the time, I see it in my coaching practice as well, where I really try and encourage people to kind of build a bit more muscle, and they're just constantly, wanting to hammer their body fat down. Yeah. And it's just always banging your head against a brick wall, because it's like, yeah, you could get there, but are you going to be able to stay there? Probably not. So what's the point in keep trying to get there, unless it's for a competition or a wedding or something like that, something that's just going to be a one-off.
Yeah.
You just want to get rid of it. But if it's for kind of the sustainable long-term physique, then you kind of need to think, right, let's stop banging my head against a brick wall here. How can I flip this on its head and go in the other direction that's going to allow me to eat more food? It's going to allow me to not have to battle my body fat percentage all the time, but still look good.
Exactly this, Harry. And there's lots of things within that to unpack. And I think the overarching theme in what you said there, and one of the phrases that I've used in the podcast many times now, is discipline equals freedom. So you spoke about when somebody's got this fat loss goal and everything's on the money, they eat similar times, they buy their food shop at the week, they cook their stuff, they know that they train Monday, Tuesday, Thursday at 5:30 after work, and it's religious, they get it done. Whereas when that goal goes away, the holiday's been, the photo shoot's been, the wedding's been, the event you want to look in shape for has been, all your structures and habits crumble and they go. So inevitably, it's going to be much harder to look remotely lean when everything around you that was putting you in a position to look even close to your best is now gone. And also within that, you're talking about muscle building phases. I think if you're as adherent to the diet and the structure for a muscle building phase as you are for a fat loss phase, you'll be astounded at how many gains you can make as a natural athlete initially. I know nowadays you and I would be lucky to put on a kilo a year, even if we were very anal and tracked absolutely every variable. But in the initial stages, there's actually a lot of tissue that can go on if you, especially when the food comes in and you're doing the same kind of structure and habits as you had when you were trying to diet down for 8-12 weeks. If you do that for a muscle building phase, you might find that your physique looks radically different and you pack on 3, 4, 5 kilos of muscle in a period that would never have been possible later on in your training career, but you can benefit from it now. And like you say, it buys that freedom later on to look that little bit better. And one of the questions that I'll get asked is, oh, how can you have abs when you are not as lean as normal? And that's because they're thicker and more developed, so they show even when there's a little bit more body fat on them. And equally, fat distribution is different depending on how much muscle you have over the years as well, because it spreads out a bit more, as I'm sure you'll know, Harry.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's funny when you see people, and I understand it, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but like when people, they only train abs when they're dieting, but that's, and you will build, you can build muscle when you're dieting to some degree, I think, especially if you're a beginner, but it's having, like you said, it's having the discipline to train your abs when you can't see them necessarily. Do you know what I mean? It's like, that's when you're actually going to build them up a little bit more. And the thing is, you can have a bit more freedom during a muscle gain phase, but there still needs to be like a good 80-90% of that structure. I suppose you get the freedom from the fact that you get to eat more calories, so that just instantly gives you a bit more food freedom and flexibility. You don't necessarily have to track every single macro and do it all in advance, but it's the people that just train really hard when they're dieting. I typically recommend it to some of my clients. We almost do it the other way around. So quite often, I'll get a client training 5 days a week during a muscle gain phase, and we'll drop it to 4 days a week during a fat loss phase. We actually train a little bit less because recovery is going to be impacted. Energy, we want to make sure every session is really good. I'd rather 4 really good sessions than 5 mediocre sessions. So in actual fact, people think, oh, I've got to train 6-7 days a week when I'm dieting down. And I actually think no, because you should have done the hard work already. We let the diet do most of the work now, and we just kind of keep things ticking over, make sure you're enjoying your training and you're not absolutely knackered. I don't do that with everyone. Sometimes, we just keep it the same, but just as an example of, actually, you should be doing more training when you're not dieting, because that's how you build that kind of long-term physique.
Yeah, more volume, more intensity. You've got more calories, so you've got more room and scope to lay down some tissue. So if that's not a kind of kick in the right direction for you to kind of structure and commit to a muscle building phase in order to buy yourself some freedom longer term, then I don't know what will be, Harry. So next up and last thing that we'll cover on this episode is the age-old HIIT versus LISS. What is better, Harry? What's better?
What's better for what? That would be my question back to you. How annoying is it to answer a question with a question? So yeah, there are a couple of things to consider with sort of HIIT versus LISS or MISS or whatever you want to call it. Ultimately, for fat loss, it probably doesn't matter, providing calories are matched. I think that's the point. I think ultimately we are, I don't want to simplify it too much, but ultimately we are looking at the kind of calorie expenditure of it. So with HIIT, you can expend or burn, to use the colloquial term, more calories in a shorter period of time. So that's going to be great for people who are relatively time poor, and they just want to kind of smash out maybe 100, 150 calories of cardio after their workout.
Yep.
However, there is a limit to how much HIIT you can do, because it's high intensity in nature. there probably is a limit to how many calories you can expend in one session. Whereas with sort of miss or liss, the lower intensity stuff, you could, it sounds incredibly dull, but if you find a good Netflix series, it might not be. But you could do, you know, an hour on a bike or a treadmill or a stairmaster, and you could clock up 600 calories.
Yeah.
You're never going to be able to clock up 600 calories doing HIIT training. And if you are, it's not HIIT training, basically. You know, HIIT is high intensity. So LISS allows you to have a greater almost capacity to burn calories, but you do need to have the time to do it. So
time to do it, but equally you've spoken there about recovery, and many of the listeners will know that I've had a bit of a fitness menopause and I'm doing a bit more functional fitness and more Ollie March and CrossFit style stuff. So I have 100% noticed on the days that I've done conditioning, the next day I'm much less able to go in and maybe be as strong if I'm using muscles related to that. So if I do a rowing and burpee metcon, if I'm doing back the next day in pull-ups, I'm a bit tighter. I'm a bit sorer. There's no two ways about it. It's just not the same. Whereas if I'd burned the same number of calories from that metcon with steps or on a treadmill or on a stationary bike for an hour, I'd be good to go the next day. I mean, many of my dieting phases, I had no forceful cardio whatsoever. I actually just had like 15 to 17,000 steps, which the key variable you spoke about there, Harry, was time, not anything else.
Yeah, so speaking of concurrent training, which is essentially trying to do endurance and you know, resistance training at the same time, it seems to affect strength more than it does hypertrophy. So if your goal is simply, and this is why, to be fair, you've got a lot of kind of CrossFit athletes and people that do that style of training, they're still in great shape because the endurance doesn't tend to really interfere too much with the actual hypertrophy. But if your goal is strength, maybe you're a power lifter or a weightlifter or something like that, you might be better off with a lower intensity because there is something called, like you said, an interference effect. And it seems to affect lower body in particular. So if you were to do, this recent study, it was looking at cycling, HIIT training and running HIIT training, and then resistance training, and it seemed to affect lower body strength. So if you were to do, say, sprints and then you were to do maybe squats a day or two later, you might find that your lower body strength is affected. And like you said, you had an example there where you were kind of doing rowing. I imagine it's the same thing. You know, you're kind of obviously using your back quite a bit there, so your strength is going to be affected. But it doesn't appear, at least within the limitations of the study, it doesn't appear to affect hypertrophy, and you know, that might be what most people want anyway. So
yeah, the vast majority of people listening will have that, and I certainly know that I steered away from high intensity stuff or kind of more functional stuff in the past because it affected my recovery to go into the gym and match my logbook and beat my logbook when my calories were going down. Whereas I suppose when you're on more food, I think doing, and again, this is an argument for another day and discussion for another day, doing cardio when you've got more calories in, not necessarily just using cardio to create a deficit, but using cardio as a tool to get better at it, can be quite an interesting one. So HIIT versus LISS tends to fall into the fat loss debate, Harry, as I'm sure many of your clients are like, oh, well, should I be doing HIIT or LISS? And you're saying, well, it depends is always what your goal is and what your time schedule's like rather than anything else. Is there any...
It comes down to enjoyment as well, you know, like you said, like, you know, LISS is, I mean, some people, to be fair, some people love it because, you know, I might suggest to them, like, are there any sort of menial tasks that you can do? Like, so for example, if you know, you're normally sitting on the sofa scrolling through Instagram, can you do that, you know, doing an incline walk on a treadmill or cycling on a bike? Because then you're doing something you would have normally done anyway, but you're adding a little extra to it, you know, a little extra movement. But if that absolutely bores you to tears, then, you know, HIIT it's short, sharp. Again, to use that kind of lamppost thing earlier, it's a little bit easier, you know, when you're doing these AMRAPs, EMOMs, whatever you want, it's very short and sharp. There's not much to, you know, to get to the next stage. Whereas like, you've probably seen that meme going around of the treadmill. It's like, oh, 60 minutes left. That's 15 minutes 4 times, you know, or like 10 minutes 6 times or whatever. And that's kind of what it is. It's like a drag for some people, but if you can somehow fill that time with something that you would be doing anyway, like I said, if you just on your phone responding to just basic emails or scrolling through Instagram or watching a Netflix or YouTube or something like that, it's something that I've done quite a lot in my back in my competing days and stuff, because it's just what I preferred. But
yeah,
I also accept the fact that it's a bit boring for some people.
Very similar to me, Harry. When I've done my hardest diets, I've gone out for steps, or I've been on an incline treadmill, and I've just answered emails, I've answered Instagram DMs, I've written content, I've phoned people, and you can do that. Whereas if you're doing a HIIT session, or like you say, one of these EMOMs or Metcons, you've got to really, you're going balls to the wall for 10, 15, 20 minutes at most, and you're done and it's over and the calorie burn's good. But again, it comes down to a lot of different factors. One question around it that I've got from a science perspective, is there anything to do with afterburn? Because that's a kind of a famous phrase. Is that something that you've looked into when it comes to HIIT?
Yeah, so it's called EPOC, EPOC, and I can't remember what that stands for. But I think it's something like, for HIIT training, it's about 7%, and for LISS, it's about 3%. That's off the top of my head. I'd have to go back and have a look at it, but it's called EPOC, and yeah, it's trivial, really.
Yeah.
And also you've got to consider that you're going to be burning slightly less calories doing HIIT, so it's 7% of fewer calories.
Yeah.
3% of, do you know what I mean? So it's sort of it becomes a little bit of a wash, really. The only other thing about HIIT as well, which we should probably touch on, is HIIT is probably potentially going to be slightly more applicable in terms of work capacity and work rate to resistance training.
Yeah.
It does become its problem in a way, because it is effectively almost as tough as a resistance training session. So you do have that, like I said, that recovery and interference that you need to factor in. But if you're doing like 60 seconds of hard graft, when you think of a heavy set of squats, that could be 60 seconds of hard graft. Do you know what I mean? So you've got it is all a bit of a balance, really, like anything. And I sort of hate to use that word, but it is really. So I think sometimes you've got to also think, what is your ultimate goal? Like, do you want to get kind of cardiovascularly fit as well? And is your fitness affecting your training? If you could do more squats, but you can't because you're blowing, then it might be worth incorporating something like HIIT, where that is going to have a little bit more of a carryover into your training.
Yeah, that's a great point. The transfer effect of being good at cardio rather than just good at walking on a treadmill might benefit you in those higher rep 12, 15, 20 rep sets, where you might build more muscle in the long term as well. So yeah, that's just another layer to the question that we've answered. So we've used science during this episode from an applicable perspective with Harry in terms of his famous whiteboard chats. He's brought us 5 questions which we've gone in depth on. I hope you've all enjoyed it. Last question for you, Harry, is where is the best place for people to connect with you?
So best place is definitely Instagram. Just ask me any questions on there. I try to get back to them, as soon as possible, really. And then obviously website at tasteoffitness.co.uk.
And what's your handle on Insta? Sorry, Harry.
It's just Harry Ranson, all one word. There's only one of me, apparently. So
there's only one Harry Ranson. That'll be in the show notes below. If you're with us at this point, folks, and you've enjoyed the episode, take a screenshot, pop it in your Instagram story, tag me at call.cambro, tag Harry. Let us have your feedback, and I cannot wait to speak to you all again very, very